And our first speaker is Carole Cusack, Professor of Religious Studies at Sydney University. And Carole is speaking about sinless perfectionism and spiritual violence in Tinker, Tailor and the Fellowship. And so our panelists are speaking on fairly distinct topics. So I think what we'll do is go paper, questions, rather than keeping all the questions to the end. So Carole, your time starts now, and I will warn you in the chat if I can, I think I can do that, when you've got 2 minutes to go.
Okay, I'm going to share screen now if I can. So I'm turning it on. And what I want to share is the PowerPoint, and I'm going to play it as a slideshow. Can you see that now?
No.
Oh, sugar. Okay, look, I think I'm just going to not bother about that, and I'll just give my presentation as a presentation and we can cope. It's not going to be that difficult. Okay. We all are aware that recently there's been quite a lot of journalistic activity around violence that's been occurring within Christian churches and denominations in Australia. And the two most obvious, I suppose, cases have been the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse, institutional responses to, and also the project that Julia Baird has been involved with for some time, which has exposed, for example, domestic violence, intimate family violence in the homes of various Sydney evangelical clergy. The two groups that I'm talking about today, Tinker Tailor, which was based in Sydney, and the Fellowship, which was based in Melbourne, are they're very interesting groups to me. They're kind of deviant, which is a word that's difficult to use. They sort of fit within the paradigm of new religious movements, even though both of them were nested within mainline Christian denominations. Tinker Tailor was primarily Anglican, the Fellowship was primarily Presbyterian. They were linked by a number of important things, and some of them I won't be able to do justice to today. Lindsay Grant and his brother Ronald Grant respectively led Tinker Tailor and the Fellowship. And the fact that these two young men shared very close kind of theological viewpoints at the time of these two movements coming into existence is very important. The brothers actually later fell out and didn't communicate with each other for decades. The interesting thing is that they married two sisters. Ronald Grant married Nancy Agnew, and Lindsay married Adeline, generally known as Del Agnew. The marriage of Lindsay and Del was not successful and was dissolved by a divorce only a few years later. Nancy and Ronald remained married. Tinker Tailor's usually called Tinker Tailor because of an interior decorating company that the group actually owned. The Fellowship is a kind of standard Christian sort of term for a body where people share prayer and spend time together. But this kind of fellowship was a little bit more than that. And I'm interested in a number of elements. What the perfectionist theology they were interested in was really about, obedience and discipline, and charisma, I guess, as part of leadership. But you'll see that the methodology that I'm looking at is mostly about things like, how do you study groups like this? You know, how do you make sense of them? Largely because the sources are rather poor. So if we think about sinless perfectionist theology, this is a heresy, inverted commas. Again, I realise that's a theological term. It matters more to insiders than outsiders, which had been kind of present in Christianity since late antiquity and through into the period in the immediate aftermath of the Reformation, where quite a number of groups kind of cut loose from institutional church authority, a la the Roman Catholic Church, began asserting that once you were saved, you couldn't actually sin. And because salvation was predestined, the saved could actually engage in criminal or sinful activities without imperiling their salvation. Usually, rather frivolously, I say it meant you could barbecue babies and have sex with goats and God would still let you into heaven. But this is a little bit different to the version of perfectionism that emerged in these particular groups, and they were more influenced by what's commonly called Cusack theology, which takes its name from Cusack in the Lake District in the UK, where some Christian conferences took place. Cusack is it feeds into a number of different Christian phenomena in the 20th century, the exclusive brethren, for example, and also Watchman Nee's Little Flock movement. It's a theology which is also sometimes referred to as the holiness movement, or the groups are called holiness churches. And it emphasises, sinless perfectionism, except mostly they don't like that term. And the term that's commonly used is sometimes entire sanctification, and sometimes they just talk about walking in the light. But the general idea is that getting justified by faith in the classic Protestant manner is a separate event and issue to becoming sanctified. And what happens is that when you become sanctified, you can be rendered sinless. Now, most groups don't generally argue that such a person was born without sin. They are born again without sin, which I suppose is a little bit similar. Okay, so where do we go with this? When we look at the attractions of this kind of theology, we realise that the Grant brothers, who were brought up in Sydney, were also members of a kind of upper stratum of Sydney's society, what were commonly referred to as good or even great Christian families with connections to the Archbishopric, various holders thereof of Sydney. It was a upper middle class kind of movement that they founded. And the emphasis on perfectionist theology came in two ways. The mother of the Agnew girls, Vera Agnew, who lived in Hobart in a grand estate called Oatlands, another great family. Her husband's grandfather had been the first governor of Tasmania, and, it's kind of definite kind of snobbery involved here. Vera Agnew was an enthusiast for Cusack theology, and she was one of those women who was revered in the group of Christians around her as having great insight and perhaps being able to discern things. And she told stories about prophecies that related to her daughters, and the men who married them, the Grant brothers, definitely took up this idea very strongly, though it became more powerful in Tinker Tailor, that the discernment of Del Agnew was something beyond merely being a good Christian or knowing a Bible or whatever, that she was kind of positioned as a seer with an ability to discern spirits, particularly evil spirits. And in fact, as Tinker Tailor's theology kind of developed, she was ultimately hailed as being born without sin and therefore unable to sin. Nancy Agnew in the fellowship never had quite that sort of status. Initially, the Grant brothers looked pretty normal. Lindsay was involved with the Evangelical Union at the University of Sydney, where he studied medicine. He was also involved in the InterVarsity Fellowship. But gradually, he and Ronald kind of broke away from the evangelical mainstream that they were associated with, and they established these groups that fitted around them because they were both charismatic speakers. They both had kind of lieutenants as well. Ronald Grant's lieutenant, Alan Neil, was another member of a great Christian family in Melbourne, with a lot of influence in various areas. So one of the first things is that the Grant brothers expected to be treated as charismatic leaders, though their charisma was largely involved in terms of, what's the right word? Interpreting scripture and applying Bible verses and so on and so forth. In Tinker Tailor, Del Agnew was able to discern whether people were walking in the light, and if they were out of the light, they had to be brought back into the light. And the way that this was normally done within these very kind of close environments, the fellowship was bigger than Tinker Tailor. Tinker Tailor probably never had more than 50 members. And when David Millikan wrote his popular book about it in 1991, there were about 12 left, and it's largely dispersed. The groups withdrew from mainline church circles, focused around their charismatic leaders, were demanded. It was demanded by the leaders that they give absolute obedience. It became part of the culture of both groups that there was humiliation, surveillance, authoritarian control, physical beatings, sleep deprivation, starvation, working for no pay. And one of the interesting things about doing all of this sort of research is how boring it is. It's astonishing how many new religious movements dissolve into this kind of brutal, ridiculous, where you get to the point where actually if you're unsympathetic, you think, how on earth did anybody kind of stick with this? Everybody normally charts a pattern, though, of an initial period of inspiration and kind of joy and a general kind of disillusionment that sets in, but over a long time where, in fact, it then becomes quite difficult to actually leave. The thing is that it's also quite difficult to research these groups, partly because there are only a single popular book about either of them. David Millikan's Imperfect Company is about Tinker Tailor. He is a United Church minister, and he wrote it from an explicit Christian viewpoint, seeing these people as largely deviant and heretical. The book on the fellowship by Morag Swartz is similar. She has the same issue, like she's criticising the group from a theological corrective viewpoint, and she's very concerned to uphold kind of the legitimacy and the dignity of proper, true evangelical Christianity, as opposed to this kind of perversion that was allowed to grow. So here I'm interested just in saying a few things about how you might approach it. The next thing to mention is that primary sources are really hard to get hold of. Swartz actually admits in her book and in some interviews that the documents that the Presbyterian Church in Victoria had seem to be embargoed. They certainly have never been released publicly. And I have tried, both by talking to people like Stuart Piggin and Glenn O'Brien, and also at least one approach to Moore College about whether there are archives that deal with the Tinker Tailor situation in Sydney, and I've generally drawn a blank. The interesting thing is, though, that the popular books actually contain loads of really useful material, and I've been thinking about researching and how you could get a bit of a grip on it. Now, if we want to go with the one really mainstream and well-documented new religious movement study is the study of leaving these sorts of groups, total groups. And I've done some work there generally, and there's excellent kind of research by some of the kind of old guard of new religious movement studies, Ben Zablocki, David Bromley, Stuart Wright, who's probably the youngest of all of those scholars. Ben Zablocki died only recently, on things like the reliability of exit testimony, because people talk about how these testimonies generally are always negative, whereas people who are interviewed when they're in the group naturally give more positive testimonies. Stuart Wright's approach is the one that I like the most. He talks about leaving new religious movements and totalizing groups as being like intimate partner breakdown, that it allows the person to kind of be able to explain why they'd stayed for so long, also why they're terribly conflicted when they leave, and why they may have mixed feelings, mixed kind of emotional feelings about why they didn't stay or did stay, or why they even miss some of the aspects of the group ages after they've actually gone, and even while they want to uphold that kind of idea. The other thing that I was interested in, and in fact Marion is responsible for this, is because I talked a couple of years ago, I think 2 years ago, at the AASR about charismatic female leadership in new religious movements. My example there was Anne Hamilton Byrne of Australia's probably best known new religious movement, Family, which in some ways actually is superficially quite similar to these groups, even though it wasn't Christian, because she certainly targeted the upper echelons of society and people who were moneyed and powerful. Tinker Tailor bought a castle in Scotland and a 17th century rectory in Cornwall and ran these as kind of, hotel businesses. And the family similarly bought extravagant properties in the UK and the US, and kind of had grandiose ideas about their ancestry and their status in society. So there's some interesting things going on there. Marion actually asked me after that presentation, what about Del Agnew? And I actually did look up and ran around and found a few little things that said that in fact she had exploited her attractiveness and her sexuality, as well as kind of her spiritual discernment faculties in order to subordinate people to her will, etc. And I was thinking, though, about Del Agnew and why actually Millikan treats her far less sympathetically than he treats Lindsay Grant. And the late Liselott Frisk, who was an intimate friend of mine and who unfortunately died this year far, far too young, researched a group in Sweden called Knutby Philadelphia, which was a Pentecostal group that, a bit like both the Fellowship and Tinker Tailor, imploded in scandals, sex abuse, adultery, legal cases, though in fact in this case Knutby Philadelphia really took the biscuit, because there was even a murder, another attempted murder, and a whole lot of things that kind of scandalised Swedish society. The interesting thing is that this particular group began as a fairly ordinary Pentecostal church and developed one distinctive doctrine, which was a particular woman who was part of the group, called Asa Waldo, was actually the bride of Christ, and she was being kept in sequestration with special spiritual powers of discernment because Jesus was going to marry her when he came back to earth in the second coming. And I actually think that the work that Liselott has done on Asa Waldo, who she interviewed on multiple occasions, actually has quite a number of synergies with what is known about Del Agnew in terms of attractiveness, sexuality, power, then a period of disempowerment, becoming depressed and taking it out in incredibly violent and appalling ways upon the members of the small religious community that followed her, partly because of her own frustrations at not fulfilling the great kind of destiny. Certainly Agnew seems to have had intense millenarian expectations and to believe that Jesus was going to come, right now. And this was one of the reasons why she had to keep her remnant ready, walking in the light for him. So I can see a way to go ahead. I normally start by doing something pretty unambitious. So I think the first step is to try to write a profile for the World Religions and Spirituality Project, which is run by David Bromley, because that doesn't actually require an argument. It just requires a timeline and an exposition of the theology and the personnel and the way in which we know about the group in terms of their public profile. And I've done that with a couple of other Australian new religious movements, and I found it really helpful. So that's what I'm going to do next, and I should probably stop talking.
Thanks very much, Carole. I have some questions, but I will let other people go first. If you can use the hand raising function to do that, or otherwise turn yourself on so I can see you and raise your hand in real life.
Very briefly, for someone outside of us not familiar with the context, what period is this happening in?
Okay, that's a good question. Tinker Tailor really gets, and the fellowship get going around about 1940. Lindsay Grant meets Del Agnew in 1932. She's 12. He's 21, I think. He's 9 or 10 years older than her. And it's by the time he's about 30. So, yes, around 1940. And its heyday, for the fellowship goes on longer. Tinker Tailor is in disarray and practically doesn't exist when Millikan does his research around about 1990, publishes his book in 1991. Lindsay Grant is 80, Del Agnew is 71. They are both very much cut off. The businesses that the group ran had gone bankrupt or fallen apart, and most of their members had left. Murad Swartz's work on the fellowship shows that the fellowship actually came to become very, very powerful institutionally in the Presbyterian Church in Victoria. And it took over 3 churches, Mount Evelyn, Surrey Hills and Camberwell, entirely, and kind of alienated all of the mainline Presbyterians. And what happened again was in the 90s, so the 90s is kind of important decade, the Presbyterian Church of Victoria issued a document indicating that this group was deviant, heretical, whatever you like, and had to basically be rooted out. And at least at one church, Mount Evelyn, there was like a seismic collapse and an expulsion of all of the fellowship people, which sort of parallels, I guess, the Newby Philadelphia thing, except that the parish continued because it was a mainline Presbyterian parish, just the one that had been taken over. So I think the fellowship is probably still stronger and more in evidence because Ronald Grant and his companion Alan Neil actually left a generation of 5 men who were to take over, whereas in Sydney, Lindsay Grant and Del Agnew had no succession plan. For a while, one of his daughters, Elspeth, was sort of groomed to be in charge, but she broke with her family as well. And so the next generation leader, if in fact he ever had any intention of handing over to her, went away, and there was no one to inherit the movement such as it was.
Thank you.
Helen, did you have a question?
Well, my question was going to be about succession and any children of the Grants and the Agnews. So you started talking about that, Carole. You might want to continue as to whether any of the other members had children. And I'm interested in what became of those children and whether they actually went public with any of what was going on.
This is a really important question. Lindsay Grant and Del Agnew were married for 4 years. They had no children. It's pretty astonishing, actually, that they divorced in 1951. A document does survive, which is a long letter that Grant wrote to the Anglican Archbishop explaining the circumstances of the marriage. And the argument that is put forward is that it was invalid. He was very much obsessed with Del Agnew, but she apparently was in love with another man who became a member of the fellowship, who was called Fletcher Denniston, and she was pressured into marrying Lindsay Grant, and she ultimately says she never believed they were married, and it sounds like it was a most unsatisfactory arrangement. But even after the divorce, they remained, kind of unified by their role as teacher and seer. Grant married a second time a woman called Margaret Debnam, and he had a bunch of children with her. And those children were used to kind of discipline and humiliate the other children in the movement because they were deemed to have been born sinless and to walk in the light always. Now, this is an interesting thing, which I didn't say when I was talking about this, but one of the questions, you know, when you do interviews or people talk to you in the press, they usually say, how did you find out about this? And I sort of forget, but it's this. Fletcher Denniston, the man that Del Agnew wanted to marry, married a woman called Nance, and they had some children and they all became Tinker Tailor members. And when David Millikan wrote his book, his three principal informants were Grant and Agnew themselves, whom he visited regularly, and he said they were always hospitable and were quite happy to talk to him about what they believed and what they were doing. Though, of course, they put quite a different slant on it to how he did. But his third informant was a woman who I think at the time was 26, whose name is Sarah Denniston, and she's the daughter of Fletcher Denniston and Nance. Now, I taught her at university, and I knew her very well, which is one of the reasons why I knew about this group. And actually, she's not the only student I had whose parents were in Tinker Tailor, and who, though she was actually brought up in it entirely and didn't run away till she was, I don't know, maybe 20. And she was one of the alarm raisers, one of the people who kind of went public with the story. Now, if we think about that kind of thing, it's not like, though, the group of kids from Anne Hamilton Burns' family who have really dominated the media coverage of the family in general. There is very little in the way of media coverage of either Tinker Tailor or the Fellowship. What went on with them is largely seen, I think, by outsiders as some kind of weird, you know, little infighting within Christian churches, which, you know, non-religious people are kind of not that interested in. So it doesn't have the same level of resonance. But certainly amongst my acquaintance, I've had two students for a number of years whom I got to know very well, whose parents were in Tinker Tailor and who were brought up in it. And Sarah Denniston is on the record as the principal denouncer of what went on.
Thank you.
Neville, and then we'll make this the last question and then move on to Elenie.
I'm interested, Carole, in the connection between the historical intellectual stream and the bubble of the new religious movements. And I'm thinking here is in the origins, you referred to Keswick and the Holiest movement. So in terms of, you know, the teachings, you know, was there a connection not only with the UK but with the American holiness movement, you know, in terms of, you know, connecting with that heritage and or was it just simply a bubble, you know, around a cult figure?
I think that my answer might be it's not really either. Certainly neither group had anything to do with American Christianity at all. They were highly snobbish, very, very proud of British ancestry, Scottish and English principally. But in terms of the Keswick theology, yes, there's a definite link. Vera Agnew was a kind of Keswick devotee. They read authors that Keswickly influenced people, appreciated people like Paget Wilkes. They were attracted by its experientialism, which of course a lot of people now connect a lot of the holiness movement with Pentecostalism. And that's kind of interesting because certainly there isn't any kind of Pentecostal tinge to either of these movements. But I suppose one of the words that Millikan uses, usually kind of cautiously, is enthusiasm, which I think is a good term because if you're an evangelical, that rings alarm bells. Enthusiasm is not good theologically, but it stops short of full Pentecostalism. And the problem is, I suppose, for the Grant brothers, because they were such elitists, They couldn't really have embraced a Pentecostal view because that means the gifts of the Spirit are for everybody. They didn't believe that. The gifts of the Spirit are for the authorities, the people who lead the unenlightened followers. It's their job to be sinless, to walk in the light, and to offer the not just example but also severe correction to all of those who aren't able to reach that spiritual status.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Carole, and questioners. And now it's time for Elenie Poulos. Elenie has a slideshow, and I've checked, and participants able to share slides, share screen is actually turned on. Elenie, are you able to share your screen?
Unmute myself and I'll give it a go. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we have you.
Okay, excellent. All right. Thank you. This is a presentation of the findings of my PhD thesis, which I submitted earlier this year. And the PhD thesis is called The Politics of Belief, the Rise of Religious Freedom in Australia. And this presentation is on what I found about the 3 discourses of religious freedom in Australian public life. Okay. For many people, the issue of religious freedom burst into Australian public discourse during the lead up to marriage equality. But I mean, as you would know, religious freedom has been a matter of public debate in Australia since the early to mid 1800s. Religious freedom is one of the few rights included in the Australian Constitution, but the constitutional protections are are limited and are usually interpreted quite narrowly by the courts. And in the absence of a national human rights instrument, religious freedom, at least for a while yet, is addressed in federal law only through a series of exemptions or exceptions in anti-discrimination law. Much of the research on religious freedom in Australia has therefore focused on the law, how it protects or does not protect religious freedom, and the implications of this for majority religious institutions, organisations and groups, minority religious communities, women, LGBTI people, and its influence on other so-called moral issues such as abortion, euthanasia and sexuality. There's also been considerable research conducted within the field of sociology of religion, much of it about the religious demography of Australia, the impact of religious diversity on social cohesion, and the context between religious freedom and other so-called competing rights. Within all of this, however, little attention has been paid to the construction of the discourse of religious freedom in Australian public life. My PhD seeks to address this gap by exploring the rhetoric of religious freedom, by examining the discourse of religious freedom in public debates over a period of about 35 years. I studied 4 different types of public discourse. I studied the 14 submissions by official church bodies to the 2012 inquiry into draft legislation which attempted to consolidate all anti-discrimination law, and I did that by using a manual discourse coding. I looked at all 20 public inquiry reports, from inquiries into religious freedom and inquiries on broader human rights issues that included some substantial consideration of religious freedom. And I used a critical public policy methodology for that analysis called What's the Problem Represented to Be? I looked at all 663 parliamentary speeches given during marriage debates, so since 2004 when the Howard government changed the law until the time that marriage equality was passed. and I used a corpus-assisted analysis for that. I also looked at all 40 editorials on religious freedom published in the Australian between 2015 and 2019. Just as a point of comparison, during that same time, those 4 years, the Sydney Morning Herald published 8 and the Age published 5. And I used media framing analysis for that. I also applied Linda Woodhead's idea of 5 concept or categories of religion when I did all of this analysis, the assumption being that different discourses of religious freedom will rest on and or display different representations of religion. Taken together, the analysis of these texts shows the development of 3 distinct discourses over time. All are present to various degrees across the 3 phases that I've identified, but one discourse clearly dominates in each phase. And there are 2 assumptions in the public discourse on religious freedom that are almost never challenged or interrogated and are worth noting. The first is that religious freedom is a good thing, except for bad religion, and that's usually confined to mentions of child marriage, religiously motivated terrorism kind of stuff. It's understood as a core value of liberal democratic society and a necessary condition for a peaceful pluralistic society. The second assumption is that religious freedom is not well protected in Australian law, but whether and to what extent this needs to be fixed as a matter of principle or to improve people's lives is, of course, contested. All right, so here are the 3 discourses. The first of these is what I've called the religious diversity discourse. It was developed in the context of an increasingly pluralistic Australia. It casts vulnerable religious minorities as needing improved protection against discrimination. The second discourse, balancing rights, developed in the context of expanding LGBTIQ rights and a conservative Christian minority portraying itself as besieged by rising secularism, frames religious freedom and the associated right to freedom of religious expression, mostly religious expression, as threatened by an imbalance with lesser equality rights. The third discourse casts belief as that which religious freedom is meant to free. And this discourse became a powerful tool and is a powerful tool of the conservative right to legitimise ongoing discrimination against LGBTIQ people and undermine progressive social politics. Okay, a bit more about each discourse now. So the context for the public policy debate on religious freedom during this time, so 1984 marks the first inquiry on religious freedom in Australian life by parliamentary or statutory body. It was the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board. So the context included, of course, increasing migration and growing cultural diversity, September 11 and the war on terror, and the experiences that people were hearing about of harassment, vilification and discrimination amongst members of minority religious groups. In this discourse, religion is understood as culture, ritual and embodied practice, and religious freedom understood as the right of people to practice and express their religious traditions and beliefs. This discourse casts religious minorities as vulnerable and needing improved protection against discrimination and prejudice, and it casts religious freedom as a tool for social cohesion. Christian churches are often envisaged as part of the solution, building interfaith relationships and understanding about religion amongst general society, even while their privileges in law were often cast in this discourse as a threat to minority religious groups and in need of limitation. During this phase, the churches were opposed to any further protection of religious freedom in law. The balancing rights discourse developed in the context of expanding LGBTIQ rights and public support of those rights. An increasingly influential conservative Christian minority, portraying itself as besieged by rising secularism, and the Victorian anti-vilification laws to protect minority religious groups. In this discourse, religion is understood as identity claim, usually based on a confessional understanding of religion centred on institutions and sets of authorised beliefs. Religious freedom and freedom of speech became intertwined rights that sit at the top of a hierarchy of rights. They are fundamental freedoms threatened by an imbalance in the law with lesser and optional equality rights. The discourse casts religious freedom as a tool for maintaining and advancing the privilege of Christian churches, a privilege which is good for society in the face of rising secularism. The other significant thing about this discourse is that it was taken on by supporters of LGBTIQ rights. Not wanting to be seen to be opposed to religious freedom, advocates sought to uphold it alongside LGBTIQ rights. And it's interesting to note that for policy actors and for LGBTIQ advocates, this remains the discourse of choice, even though the language of politicians and the public debate has settled mostly around a third discourse. Ironically, it's this discourse of balancing rights that has served to entrench the framing of LGBTIQ rights as a threat to religious freedom. The freedom of belief discourse, which is the third and final one, emerged in the context of marriage equality. All four religious freedom inquiries from 2015, for example, were responding to concerns about the threat of marriage equality, the threat from marriage equality to religious freedom. And of the 40 religious freedom editorials published in The Australian, 31 framed religious freedom as under threat from marriage equality. Having reconstructed the discourse of religious freedom from a religious diversity frame to a balancing rights frame, conservative politicians, religious leaders and lobby groups were ready to reframe religious freedom again for the marriage equality debate. Belief became the defining characteristic of religion and what religious freedom was meant to protect. Freedom of conscience was added to the already intertwined freedoms of religion and freedom of speech, and freedom of belief became the weapon of choice against marriage equality. The discourse was taken up by conservative politicians and The Australian as a powerful weapon in the push against trans rights specifically and in the culture wars more generally. This reframing of religious freedom saw issues relating to prejudice, vilification, discrimination, and harassment against people from minority religious groups almost entirely disappear from the public discourse. By 2017, the idea of religious freedom and the discourse of freedom of belief had become so powerful that they served to successfully entrench the principle of the social and legal acceptability of ongoing discrimination against LGBTIQ people on the basis of religious belief. So, in applying 4 different methods of critical discourse analysis to a variety of examples of public discourse over 35 years of public debate, this research provides for the first time an in-depth analysis of the discourse of religious freedom in Australia, exploring how 4 different sets of policy actors have constructed the idea of religious freedom and applied it to achieve certain political outcomes. Religious freedom is shown to be a powerful political construction subject to change for political purposes. It's gone from being a discourse used in support of an inclusive social agenda to one opposing it. With the rise of belief as an unassailable category of the human condition, one that ought to be protected at all costs, religious freedom is now wielded by leaders and spokespeople of conservative Christianity to legitimate in law discrimination against LGBTIQ people. it has also effectively silenced the concerns of minority religious groups who continue to face prejudice and discrimination because of their religious affiliation and religious practices. The research also demonstrates that religious freedom has become reified in the public debate, naturalised as a core democratic value and indispensable for peace in our world, thereby immunising it from interrogation and effectively neutralising it as a political construct. The public debates on both the Folau case and the draft Religious Freedom Bill centre on the extent of freedom people have to express religious beliefs that might otherwise be unlawful and which may harm or offend others. Both of those cases lend weight to my argument that the dominant discourse of religious freedom in Australia is now freedom of belief, and that this discourse is developing in such a way as to free belief from its institutional setting to the point where belief has become sacralised in public and secular discourse. In privileging the right to express a religious belief above all other rights currently protected in law, which is what the government's draft religious discrimination bill sets to do, this discourse offers little to people living with the harms caused by religious prejudice. To women, to the woman on a train spat on because she was wearing a hijab, or First Nations people fighting against the destruction of their sacred sites. The turn to belief then not only obscures other conceptualizations of religion and alternative discursive constructions of religious freedom, it appears to be erasing them, thereby making invisible religious freedom claims from anything other than a didactically focused tradition. I'll just finish by saying it's interesting to note that opponents of the current draft bill appear to be using the balancing rights discourse to make their case, with religious freedom and belief having both become immune to challenge on their own terms. Whether the balancing rights discourse maintains any political and policy muscle against the freedom of belief discourse remains to be seen.
Thank you, Elenie, for that splendid and perfectly timed presentation. We now have time for questions. Alda.
Thanks so much, Elenie. It was really fun to hear you talk about that work. It's really exciting. My question was about the way you framed the turn to belief as something that happened in these later two periods you've identified. And I was wondering what examples you have from the first period of places where religious freedom was seen to offer protections for practices that affirm other conceptions of religion besides belief. So what are examples of religious freedom in the first period in which religion is conceived as something besides belief, and what's it conceived of as there? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. I'll give it a go. So the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board's first report, or their report into their inquiry on religious freedom, which was the first ever public inquiry into religious freedom in Australia, spent a significant amount of time talking about the religious freedom rights of First Peoples, and related that to their dispossession from their land. That pretty much disappeared. I mean, by the time you get to the Ruddock report in 2017, there's a small paragraph in that report that says, we wish we could have talked about this more, but we didn't get any submissions that addressed this subject, and even I think they even approached people to talk about it, and they just couldn't get enough to include it in their consideration of religious freedom. So that's probably the main one. Also, that first report from the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board also spent a lot of time looking at a few early cases of teachers who had lost their employment in religious schools because they came out as gay or lesbian usually. So you know, but that you know, that's a bit about the expression of religious belief and the rights of institutions to employ people. But that's you know, certainly the rights of First People, I think, is the most significant example of what disappeared after that first discourse kind of, you know.
And just to follow up really quickly, is religion in that case conceived of as relationship to land? So what's the concept of religion at play?
Yeah, so as culture and as ritual and as it's kind of envisaged more holistically in terms of, you know, it's about the myriad of ways that people are embedded in and expressing their culture.
Thank you so much.
Sarah, did you have a question?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, Carole, is there a question from you?
Yeah, it's interesting, of course. Obviously, Elenie, you can't cover everything, and I think that the collection of resources that you have covered is extensive. But just following on from Alda's question, one of the things about religious freedom that doesn't kind of make it into the papers that often is the subtle, it's not very subtle actually, exclusionary practices of things like council building approvals and you know, all that sort of stuff around, no, you can't build a mosque, no, you can't build an Islamic school, no, you can't build a Gurdwara or a Hindu temple, and people protesting and all the code words. I mean, my colleague here at Sydney, Chris Hartney, has done a lot of work on that kind of thing, especially the building of temples. He wrote his entire PhD on the Cowday Temple in Sydney. And of course, the discourse around that is it uses euphemisms like parking and streetscapes as a reason why you can't have a certain kind of building, because it kind of...
Traffic.
So do you see any ways in which, like, for example, you mentioned a couple of times that the concerns of minority religious communities, and in Australia they're mostly migrant communities as well, or more recent migrant communities, we're all migrants. Can you see ways in which their particular discourses have been sidelined?
Well, I mean, there's certainly, if you look at what the Australian did, for example, from 2015, they claimed to be upholding the right to religious freedom, but they never talked about the concerns of minority religious groups. They never raised, there was one editorial that mentioned in passing an issue with the building of a Jewish synagogue somewhere. I can't remember where, but that was it. So it just in the examples of public discourse that I looked at, it pretty much disappeared from the public debate, and you know, when most people who are only vaguely interested in these things just you know, that discourse just becomes what they think religious freedom is. I'm just going to quieten my dog.
While Elenie's dealing with the background applause, does anyone else have a question? Yeah, Kathy.
Hi, Elenie. Good to see you and to hear of your work. The question that was being raised for me as I was listening to you, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this from your research, is about how we conceive truth, how we understand truth in religions, and how that's a cultural thing as well, that the understanding of what is true changes. And I didn't know whether you might have anything to say about that from what you've done.
No, I mean, that's you're right. That's a whole other issue. Except to say that in that turn to belief as what religion is about, there's an assumption that that for religious believing people, their beliefs are true, and so there's no way to kind of push back against that, because for them their beliefs are true. So there is that intersection that I think would be worth exploring, because I think it's quite fascinating.
Anyone else? Okay, we are in fact very close to time. So it's time now for our third presentation, which is from Neville, Buch in Queensland, a independent public historian. And Neville has actually sent his presentation pre-recorded. So I'm now going to attempt to share my screen and play it from my system. So I will just ask you to wait for hopefully not very long at all while I do that.
And Marion, on the last slide, I'll voice over 4 points that will sum up.
Right, okay. Oh, it's just told me that I can't minimize Zoom while I'm hosting the meeting.
I've got it here, Marion. If you want me to just do screen share, I can do it from here.
Okay, maybe you do it.
Okay, so I just got to choose the right one. And so this is a very quick video. You'll just have to listen very carefully, and hopefully the volume works. And as I said, I'll just voice over a few points on the last slide. Just wait for the slow connection. Oh my, that should just play. Got the not too sure why it's not playing. I'll try it again. Maybe. Oh.
Okay, if you stop sharing your screen, I'll try and do it again from mine. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, or okay, righty. I've just got to maximize my. Oh, there we go. All right, maximize that. Too many buttons. Sorry, I'm just trying to get a view. I'm not getting a view. Oh, wait a minute. Stop sharing. There it is.
Okay. I believe. Oh dear.
Okay, I've got it. I have got the video actually on my computer, which should work.
Okay, you share your screen then, and off we go.
Okay, so this is from my PC, and of course, the view is right in front of my.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to cover the vast terrain in 15 minutes. And merely as an introduction, I will spend the first 5 minutes describing the intellectual sources for the local religious education curriculum in Queensland. It will trouble those who see the only legitimization in the bottom-up populist movements. I then describe the mid to late 20th century global theology which is inescapably present in Queensland. the approach of top-down categorization, and finally, in bringing it together to show that the local religious education curriculum is a dynamic between local, regional and global thinking, where populist concerns are entangled in the global discourses. I conclude by reference to the misperception on populism from Thomas Frank in his criticism of Richard Oster's thinking related to education. There were leading Protestant and Catholic theologians whose ideas are central to the mid to late 20th century history of the local religious education curriculum, with some influence from Christian Orthodox traditions, Eastern and the emerging Anglican Orthodoxy, also bearing on local curriculum. In this paper, I address the input of American Protestant thought from consensus conflictual liberal historians and theologians. The argument, for good, bad, or worse, is that American Protestant thought had dominated the political discourses of Western democracies. Agree that religio-political thought is much more diverse, but what occurred in places like Queensland is that the American cultural narratives had a larger voice and was given a larger stage. So, what we often see in the local curriculum was an American interpretation of the global Protestantism as it flowed from the leading theologians and their schools of thought. By the late century, the major centers of Protestant thought were in the United States. It started in the mid-century with Reinhold Niebuhr and his brother, Richard, the theological historian. They made Union Theological Seminary and Yale University pivotal in the story. By the mid-century, the three main academic schools of religion had disseminated among 1. The general theory, 2. Phenomenology, and 3. Cultural pluralism. The result was the expansion of theological frames and curricula from neo-orthodoxy to Asian and Black theologies. The philosophic thinking had streamed between 30 to 40 theological directions. If we filter for those theological directions in American Protestant thought, we have 17 directions and groupings of influences and framing in curriculum, a number which overlap in Catholic thought, or having a separate Catholic version. The space here on the diagram is only sufficient to show 4 groupings from the United States and provide 12 key examples of Queensland religious educators, and there are more names, such as Ivan Elcorn and Ian Mava, who should also be mentioned. The major of the formative religious educators in Queensland came from the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Uniting traditions. To be clear, we are talking about religious education. These educators worked in the secular state system in all 3 sectors, as well as in the churches and the church-based colleges. Even when the curriculum was strictly Christian education, it was still understood as religious education, scoping the studies in religion to gain a better understanding of the Christian faith. Although the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Uniting traditions dominated in the innovations for religious education, the Baptist Union also had important innovators. The majority in the Baptist Union were thinking within the American conservative evangelical stream, with strong connections with the Southern Baptist Convention. In the congregational battles over religious or Christian education in the 1970s and 1980s, both for the state and denominational systems, most members of the evangelical mainstream found themselves squeezed out of the fundamentalist Baptist Union. In the formation of the Uniting Church, it was the reverse, and where the rump of the fundamentalist Presbyterian Church separated off, and only a few Uniting Church parishes becoming renegade centers for more conservative or radical positioning. The Buch parish was a center for the American neo-Calvinist stream, that is, dominion theology or theologies of dominance. Here we had populist theologies riding on quasi-intellectualism, those systems of belief which would not even be acceptable in the mainstream American Calvinist Reformed stream. Quasi-intellectualism refers to the philosophical dead ends to which the less educated of the congregations are ignorant of, or hostile towards the shifting nature of academic theologies. There is no time in this session to explore 17 theological directions or frames. I can confirm that representations among Queensland educators in all streams, and most educators were able to teach across several streams. Of course, these streams were not limited to what occurred in the United States, but there are three critical points here. First, and in the very least, the half-a-century American literature and its cultural voice in other mediums dominated the marketplace for most Anglo-democracies. Secondly, in the same period, American theological programs were introduced. And finally, leading Australian religious educators were trained in the United States and brought back the educational thinking. It is important to note that American models were resisted and adapted by the educators, but the degree of resistance or adaptation varied according to how well the educator understood American culture and differences in outlook from their non-American training. From 1945 to 1989, the social history of the state was framed by the agrarian politics of old-style labor Catholicism, Methodist moralism, and Bible-bashing pietism with a large dose of ideological quietism. The infamous quip from Premier Joe Buch was, "Don't you worry about that." It was designed as a becoming message for the electorate, meaning the Queensland voter needed not to concern themselves with troubling criticisms of policies and governance. It is a distortion in the quietist doctrine, but consistent with the piety of conservative Quakers who supported President Richard Nixon and in reference to the silent majority. The local religious curricula in Queensland, Australia, had a mixture of theological intellectualism, quasi-intellectualism, and populist thinking. In these cases, intellectualism refers to a thorough understanding of ideas employed. Quasi-intellectualism refers to apologetic recycling of philosophical dead ends. And populism is defined, from Richard Hofstadter, as thinking in undercurrents of provincial resentments, popular and democratic rebelliousness and suspiciousness, and nativism. Religious education in Queensland both aided the political culture of the state and opposed it. It depended on the theological direction or frame. Those shown on the screen were those who opposed the Joe Buch regime, from mainstream conservatives to radical innovators, often being both, and several working within the state system. The mid to late century is a significant period for global theology and local curricula, both in the diversity and misconception of religion. In his recent work, Thomas Frank believed that the old-style populism once had a mental aberration, and this is no longer the case. According to Frank, William Jennings Bryan appeared to be clinically insane. The populist psychology would be laughable if not for the extremely poor historiography being propagated. Frank's defense of populism works against diversity and continues the misconception of religion. It is ironic because Frank criticizes Richard Hofstadter's psychoanalysis of the People's Party. However, contrary to Frank, Hofstadter does not have caricatures, he has characters. Frank's only valid criticism is that Hofstadter was defending a liberal consensus orthodoxy, along with the ideological criticism of Christopher Lasch in that Hofstadter had a cultural prejudice against the lower middle class. David Brown, in his biography of Hofstadter, shows these valid criticisms are ultimately not true and are really a reaction to Hofstadter's over-the-top criticism of the New Left, where ironically the leftist criticism towards Hofstadter was exploited by neoconservative populists. The Liberal Centre was squeezed by opposite forces, as Hofstadter predicted. Furthermore, Brown demonstrated that Hofstadter's thinking overlapped into the conflictual school of history. It was never about orthodoxy, except for Frank's attachment to the orthodoxy of populism. Hofstadter's important contribution is the message on the danger of populism to education. If Frank's populism had its way, there would be no theological intellectualism of the mid-century, both in terms of neo-orthodoxy and philosophical existentialism. The better theological formation was not populism, but the Queensland challenge came from formative anti-intellectual or quasi-intellectual populist religious education.
Okay, so hopefully you can still hear me.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so you might be able to see this summary of points that I'm going to make. So, you know, the theoretical challenge here is that if we ignore the philosophical thinking around religion, we miss how entangled the populist criticisms are in educational belief. Two, it's possible to map the categories of philosophical thought with the local religious education thinking. It can be done without categorical or conceptual sliding. The problem is avoided in terms of the sliding when sociological models are taken not as absolute, but what we actually mean when we refer to models. And that is a useful artificial structure where there's no actual boundaries of imprisonment. Third, the model I presented is centered on American cultural influence. It should be noted, though, that it is an Anglo model picking up on other schemas from the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. There is, of course, the European legacy, but note that this does not exclude Indigenous voices. Now, Charlie Harris and Don Brady, the Indigenous leaders in Queensland, they also, I'm seeking to map them in their connections to American-centered models. And then finally, the take-home message is that the better theological formation was not populism, which is what I'm hearing a lot of, but the challenge actually comes from, that anti-intellectual or quasi-intellectual populist religious education. So I'll stop sharing there, and I hope that was all heard and made, and you kind of was able to follow it.
Thanks very much, Neville. And now, again, perfectly timed, and that leaves us time for questions. And I'll kick off with one. Neville, you've been focusing particularly on Queensland, and it's maybe a bit of an unfair question, but I know you're very interested in Queensland intellectual history and the distinctiveness of Queensland intellectual traditions. Do you think that the way that religious education was treated in Queensland was distinct from the ways that it developed in other states? You may not have much data, but
no. And in fact, for my PhD thesis in 1995, going back, that's the whole point. I'm actually challenging that whole Queensland exceptionalism, that whole populist narrative is what I'm actually sort of challenging. The inability, I think, even amongst scholars, amongst political scholars and political commentators in the national discourse, and maybe Marion, you can comment on this in terms of your work on church and state. There's this horrible narrative, that Queensland has played an exceptional role in the way that it's thought about things, and yet you can see that if you can track this, you can map it. You can map the whole connections with global discourses and with regional discourses, and and how it filters down. I suppose where you get the uniqueness and I wouldn't say exceptionalism, but where you get you get a local uniqueness, and I think this is the problem. There's a confusion between the local unique story and, you know, and the sort of sociological, philosophical, theological, religious sort of thinking that's going on, which is not unique.
Thanks. Aldo, do you have a question?
Yeah, it was just some clarification about how you see the American influence coming. So there was the one slide that had people's names, the 12 names in the corners with institutions, American institutions, theological institutions associated with them. And maybe you could just clarify for me how it happens that American influence is so entrenched or...
Yes, and this is not unique to Queensland. It is an Australian story, but it came out of my PhD thesis, which basically looked at the Queensland sphere as probably, I suppose the uniqueness is that Queensland led this movement. And I suppose how it happened was that there were Australian churches, Australian denominations, Protestant denominations, developed after the World War II, from the 40s, basically organisationally developed the connections with the American groups. Particularly if you look at the Baptist Union, they became very much connected with the Southern Baptist Convention. But it wasn't just the Baptist Union and that conservative evangelicalism. It was also the Methodist Church, you know, within Gilman, and a whole array of professors at in the University of Queensland who were, you know, Methodist ministers and Presbyterian Methodist ministers who went over and trained at Union Theological Seminary, Princeton University, and a whole array of places in terms of, and then religious educators too. You know, get Scarlett College in Tennessee was a major centre. So there were major centres in the United States where Queenslanders went over, trained there, brought back programs into not just Queensland, Australia. Why?
Right, that's so interesting. Thank you.
Okay, well, I have another question. Neville, when you're talking about religious education, are you you're talking mainly about, I take it, school level, yeah? Or are you talking about tertiary level as well?
I'm talking about tertiary level as well. I'm talking about all three levels, and right. and I'm also talking about on both sides in terms of religious education in churches. So I'm talking about Sunday school movements. I'm talking about the rise in Queensland, and this is where perhaps the local uniqueness is that Queensland led the whole independent Christian schooling movement that was led in Queensland, and also the independent evangelical Pentecostal colleges that were that became recognised by the state and registered by the state. That sort of also was led in Queensland with Christian Heritage College. So yeah, so there were certainly, you know, they're not exceptional, but they're locally unique in terms of both in the Sunday school movement, in the tertiary sector, and to some extent within the religious education in the state system. South Australia is also was a leader in this, and the Queensland Religious Education Curriculum Project, which was a department of the Queensland Education, which was led by Ian Maver and Elizabeth Nolan, and I'm working with Elizabeth Nolan on the history of religious education in Queensland. It was influenced a little bit about the earlier development in South Australia. South Australia sort of picked up from the University of Birmingham, from SMART, and from John Hull, picked up that thinking in studies of religion, and developed a curriculum in secondary and primary schools. And then that then was sort of, I think Garth Reith from South Australia brought it across. Garth Reith was one of the members of the team under Ian Maver in Queensland. So, and they developed this, it was a studies in religion type program in the school, which was a movement away from the old religious instruction model. And what's interesting now is that Queensland has abandoned that under Peter Beattie, and they've gone back to the religious instruction model, which is really bizarre.
Is that distinction, can you just clarify that distinction for me? Because I'm not sure I quite understand. Is the religious instruction model a sort of Christian theological model, and the studies in religion model focused on a broader range of traditions, or is there some other distinction you're talking about?
Yeah, so under the Queensland Act and other states or similar acts, is that it's what's called religious instruction, is the act that enables ministers of religion or their appointees to come in and teach students electing or volunteering to attend so many hours over the year that they can instruct in their faith. So it's an instructional model. It's it's not an educational model. People of faith coming into schools instructing in their faith is that model, as opposed to the what we understand in terms of studies of religion, and properly what is religious education.
Okay, this is where once again we're coming close to time. Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Neville, and thank you to all our presenters. I've really enjoyed that session. I'm sure everybody else has too. And don't forget if you're a member of the Australian Association for the Study of Religion, the annual general meeting is on at 1:30, and the Zoom link is in the papers that you were sent out. So all those annual general meeting enthusiasts, I will see you at 1:30. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thanks, Marion.
Bye.
Bye all.